Catastrophes leave a lasting effect on those who have lived through them. They are the focal point in some people's lives and captivate the minds of those who study them. The same can be said for the 1938 Yellow River flood. The memory surrounding this catastrophic, planned dam failure is one that continues to affect the people today. In fact, the memory surrounding the flood was so powerful, not only did it affect the people themselves, it had a strong hold on how China would be governed. Therefore, in this short podcast, I hope to convince you that the government that held control of the narrative of the flood and its aftereffects controlled the Chinese people in the governing of the state. The river itself is at the heart of a large portion of the agrarian sector of China. It provides water, irrigation, and arable lands to the surrounding territory and has been integral to the continued success of major crops such as wheat and corn. This usefulness has fostered a strange and yet strong relationship between the people and the river. This has led them to rename it to two very distinct titles, China's Lifeblood and China's Sorrow. The strange relationship continues with the title given to those who have built and maintained the dams throughout China's history. They are awarded a high honor as defenders of the nation because of the dam's tendency to flood. Though the risk of flooding was a constant issue, the people remained, demonstrating the importance of the river in determining how the people would govern their lives. In 1937, the Sino-Japanese War began. Japan was making quick work of the nationalist forces led by Chiang Kai-shek. The Chinese military was facing heavy losses because of their superior adversary. With the Japanese just outside the new capital of Wuhan, Chinese military command was left with a choice. They either break the dams and release the Yellow River, sacrificing their people and possibly slowing the Japanese advance, or they continue to retreat and defend the river at Jiangsu. In dire straits, Chiang Kai-shek made the decision to break the dams, sacrificing the people instead of the war effort. Immediately afterwards, the attempts to control the narrative of the river began. The refugee crisis was the first major battlefield of propaganda and relief efforts. The flood killed roughly 1 million people, but more importantly, it displaced another 2 million. These 2 million refugees needed three things: food, shelter, and wages to provide for themselves. All three governments sought to alleviate these wants, while simultaneously garnering popular support for their influence in relation to the flood. They all began hiring refugees to work on new dams in order to stop and control the flow of the Yellow River. They provided food, shelter, and wages to the workers while influencing their thoughts on who was the true mastermind behind the dam's breaking. The Japanese blamed the Chinese nationalists, the Chinese nationalists blamed the Japanese and the Chinese communists, while the Communist Party blamed the Chinese nationalists. All three attempted to skew the outlooks and the decisions of the people to their side through the narrative of the flood, while acting the benevolent provider in order to gain more favor. The refugees faced hardship at every turn. From the initial flooding to the dangers of working on the new dams, death and inadequacy had become characteristics of their daily lives. This is no more apparent than during the Henan famine. The famine was another after effect of the flood and occurred from 1942 to 1943. The breakdown of the efforts to rebuild the dams meant that several thousand people were without both nourishment and funds. They returned to inundated portions of China in the hopes that they would receive either food or work. Neither was the case. Governments instead implemented predatory measures with regards to Chinese food sources. They stole grain and often kept it locked away while refugees and civilians were left on the street to starve and die. Eventually, when the famine had reached its peak, governments began realizing the propaganda and narrative value of being the alleviator of the famine. The first to react as the true provider of relief were the Chinese communists. They began returning grain to the people and punished relief workers who were corrupt or were not meeting relief quotas. In contrast, the Chinese nationalists were slow to give up their predatory methods to the famine and received a lot of negative attention from other powers during the war. This would play a major role in the later views of the nationalist regime and the communist regime when it came time for China to be embroiled in a civil war. Propaganda surrounding the war and the flood would be the main factor in the determination of both memory and who would control China following the Civil War. Outside sources, such as the United States, backed the Chinese nationalists against primarily the Japanese aggressors. Linkages through free trade and the China United Relief Fund meant that in popular American propaganda, the Chinese, particularly the nationalists, were portrayed as the strong leaders who soldiered on even against extreme odds. This international propaganda greatly bolstered the nationalist hold on China. They had been waging an uphill battle since the breaking of the dam, but were able to use this positive propaganda to once again paint themselves as the wholesome leader defending China. However, it would not remain so beneficial. Following the end of the Second World War, the CCP and the KMT became embroiled in a civil war. This war created major issues for the Chinese nationalists for two major reasons. First, the people were no longer infatuated with the nationalist sentiment against an outside foe. During the war, Japan had been painted as an expansionist imperialist power that China needed to unite against in order to retain their sense of nationality. When the war ended and the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the United States became the replacement imperialist power which China united against. Because the nationalists had worked with the United States during the war, they were painted as the lackeys of imperialism, pushing the people into the arms of the communists. The narrative of the river was then brought in to seal the disdain for the nationalist regime. The communists, rightfully, painted the nationalists as the masterminds behind the dam breaking. This rallied the people behind the communist narrative and turned them against the nationalist forces. The communists would win the hearts and minds of the people, and eventually they would win the war as well. With the war over and Chairman Mao in power, China underwent a complete change, particularly in relation to memory about the war and the flood. Mao cleansed the history of the contributions of the nationalists during the war, replacing it instead with a communist retelling of the history. They became the benevolent leader that had brought China out of hardship. They imbued in the people a sense of patriotic sacrifice during the war that was so strong, people who lived through the famine have almost completely repressed the hardships they faced. At the center of this control of the people was the story of the flood. The communists used the memory of the flood as a means to control both the people and the history. This control would continue until Mao's fall, when finally new studies of history began to be researched. Memories surrounding the 1938 Yellow River flood and its aftereffects have played a major role in the governing of China. The people who controlled the narrative of the catastrophe and its aftereffects essentially controlled the people and, by extension, controlled China. Whether it was in relation to famine and refugee relief, propaganda, or the ideological differences that were vying for power, the flood lies at the heart of China from 1938 to 1952 and will continue to do so well into the future. The memory of this flood and the battle for the control of its narrative shaped China in a way nothing but a catastrophe could have.